Okay, so what we've looked at previously is tactical tricks, and tactical tricks mean things like pins and forks and discoveries that will immediately win you material and sometimes lead to checkmate. So they win the game by basically violent combinations. But if there aren't any such tactical tricks available, what are you supposed to do to improve your position? Well, that's where positional strategic chess comes into play. And this will be different things that you can do that gradually will just improve where your pieces are, will just improve your position, will just increase the amount of space you've got, things like that. And slowly but surely, if you just continue to make these little improvements in your position, eventually you should find that the tactics just appear. And so this is much more subjective, much more abstract. And it's about recognizing how the position is going to change over a long time, over many moves. So rather than quick calculations and exchanges and checks and what have you. And it's very subjective, because it's no good having pieces that look like they're in a pretty position if you happen to be a queen down. So there's an element of judgment in this, really about experience. And possibly the most important thing to think about is the one we'll start with, and it's pawn structure, pawn formation. Generally, if your pawns are all weak and can't defend each other, you're probably in some trouble. And so that's what we're going to start with looking at. So the problem with pawn structure is, of course, that it's fluid. It can change throughout the game. So a structure that looks bad early on might actually become better as you get towards the end game. So you have to sort of learn with experience, really, to make correct judgments. But there are some guidelines that we can work with which are generally true. So looking at this position, we're looking at isolated pawns. Now, isolated pawns are those who have no pawn on a row next to them. So the black pawn on c7 can never be defended by another pawn, unless, of course, something captures to end up on the line next to it. So that's an isolated pawn. And if you look around, all of black's pawns are isolated pawns. The white pawns are all able to protect each other, and they're connected. And sometimes you'll hear a chess book, a chess expert, talk about pawn islands. So you can see white has one island of pawns here and another island of pawns here. So only the two, whereas black has 1, 2, 3, 4. And generally, you want to have fewer pawn islands, generally. So what you'd find if you just put a king on for each side here, black, without some catastrophic mistake by white, can't win. Obviously, the more pieces are on the board, the more difficult it is, but this position is basically done. Black is in all sorts of trouble here. And here we've got the doubled pawns as well. And this is a situation where two pawns, obviously thanks to a capture, are suddenly in their way on the same file. So the black pawns on e6 and e5 are doubled pawns, a6, a7 doubled pawns. And in fact, of course, they're even worse because they're doubled and isolated. And so what they tend to do is get in their way. Generally, double pawns are a nuisance, but as always with strategic chess, there's exceptions. We'll get to that in a bit. So one thing that you could try to do is have a game of pawn wars here. And realistically, white shouldn't be able to win this start position. It's not a doddle for black to win either, but white realistically has no chance because his pawns can't defend each other. So yeah, give it a go and see what happens. But you should find when you play this against a friend that black has very much got the upper hand. And if you say you put on a rook each, you really would find that black has the upper hand because the pawns for white can never defend themselves. Okay, let's move on to looking at a position in a game. So this position arises after the moves in the Caro-Kann defense. So e4, I'll put the arrow on the board and show you. e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight f6, all very standard so far, knight takes f6, and now g takes f6. And we give that an interesting mark because it needs discussing. So no one is completely sure if it's sound or not. I suspect if the world's strongest computers played both sides of the board, that it would turn out that it was slightly better for white. But let's discuss. So if you took all of the pieces off the board and just left the pawns in this position, we would say black's got 1, 2, 3 pawn islands, white's only got 2, and black has a pair of double pawns and an isolated pawn. So if you took off everything but the kings here, it would definitely be an advantage to white. But there's some compensation for these weaknesses. So black has sacrificed his own pawn structure for some compensation. And if you want to hit pause and come up with some ideas as to what, feel free. But if you did, or if you didn't, well, here's some thoughts. So this f6 pawn that's come from here, although he's doubled, is actually attacking the center. So it might be that there's a chance for black to play e5 at some point. And then if captures, the pawns are no longer doubled. So when you have a double pawn that hits towards the center of the board, that's some compensation for it being doubled. Okay. The fact that the g-pawn isn't there anymore allows the bishop to develop. It could go here, and then if that pawn moves forward, the bishop's on this diagonal. And occasionally, but not straight away, it might even go to h6, but not straight away because, of course, the white bishop's attacking that one. So it's a way to develop the black bishop. It also opens up the G file, and what this means is that the black rook can just pop across one square, and suddenly if white castles kingside, which it probably is ill-advised to do, the rook would be pointing directly at the white king. And you can imagine with this bishop coming down this way and perhaps the queen coming down this way, this would be compensation for black. So it kind of makes up for the isolated pawn. You can imagine the rook here and the pawn marching off down the board to try and get at a white king that was castled over here. So this is called having compensation. What black's done here is accepted that his pawn structure is a bit yuck. But in return, he gets this open file, he gets his bishops out, he gets an attack towards the center, and it's called having compensation in chess. So when you accept one particular weakness in return for a potential strength somewhere else. So what about, in terms of making a plan, the pawn formation will play a role in how to decide what to do. So have a look at this example and hit pause if you want to try and work out some possible plans for both sides. But here's my suggestions. I'm not saying that this is exhaustive or correct, there may be others. So white's plan should be to try and pick off the weak black pawns. So we've got 1, 2, 3 pawn islands for black, just the 2 for white, and we've got these doubled isolated pawns. So if you imagine if the 2 rooks and the knight were off the board and it was just kings playing with these pawn structures, white would definitely have an advantage. So that's one thing white can try to do, is swap off pieces or launch attacks on these weak pawns. So it's quite a long-term plan, but quite effective. Black has a chance to possibly control the 2 open files. So the D file, although white can put a rook on D1 and challenge there. But this half open, it's called half because there's a black pawn missing, but the white one's there. The half open B file could be something black can counter-attack down with a rook. And obviously if black can ever swap his rubbishy pawns for white's good ones, that would be amazing. So he might consider, or he or she might consider, pushing this pawn right down the board to try and swap off for the white B pawn. That might be a possibility. In this situation, we can see that white, although he's a pawn down, is probably doing okay here. So, so white can play rook to c5 and then rook to a5 and begin mopping up these weak black pawns. And there's not really a lot black can do about it, even though the black player is now a pawn up. There's really no way to stop it. There's no way for the black rook to get into the white position. If you look where these pieces are all, squares, are all guarded by white pieces. If black, after rook to c5, plays rook here, offering a swap of rooks, white will just play rook takes this pawn, and it doesn't really help. And so arguably, although it would need really good play, it might already be that this position is lost for black just because of the weak pawns. It'd be an interesting one to play with a friend and see what you come up with. So something else in positional chess, and thinking about pawn formation, I should say, is holes. Huge feature of pawn structures, and a hole is a square that can no longer be defended by one of your own pawns. And so an enemy piece placed on a hole is usually very difficult to dislodge, particularly knights are good at that because they can jump over other pieces to get there. So let's see some examples. So the position looks pretty level at first, and yeah, it probably is, all else being equal. But white has two big holes in his position. The one at c4, which is guarded by a black pawn, but no white pawn can ever get there, or e4. And so a black piece on those two squares will be almost impossible to remove. White will want to solve this problem by moving his e-pawn forward at some point. Good morning. Yeah, sorry, one of my colleagues came in there. Yes, so white will at some point really would like to play his pawn from e3 to e4 to try and do something about fixing the hole. And what's interesting is if black plays f6 to f5, which that pawn, the white pawn, then cannot move forward, what black actually has done is given himself a hole at e5. So it's all pros and cons. You really have to evaluate based on the position. Let's have a look at this one. So this time black has the holes in his position. So he's got them at d5. That's pretty much a permanent hole unless he can force the pawn forward somehow. And if he's castled on the king side and there's no bishop at g7, then they really are crucial holes. So black has got some problems there. If white can perhaps put a black square bishop or a knight or a queen, I mean, that would be really, really dangerous. And you might remember from the fork section of how dangerous it is for a knight landing on f6 when a king's on g8, things like that. So black, if he or she has this position, really needs to keep their black squared bishop to guard the two holes. And actually, it's a perfectly safe formation if you've still got the black squared bishop, because then the holes are guarded. And of course, black always has the possibility of moving the pawn forward to fill the hole. So they're potential weaknesses, but this one on d5, a white knight here, would be very, very dangerous. So definitely a weakness on d5, possibly a potential one later on f6 and h6. So black needs to keep an eye on these two black squares. So next thing, backward pawns can be a real weakness, especially in an endgame. And a backward pawn, which will often have a hole in front of it, is one that's been left behind by the pawns next to it. Because what it means is that their fellow pawns are too far ahead of them to defend them. And so rooks and queens especially love to gang up on these pawns on half-open files. That's a file with only one pawn on it. So let's see an example to see what I mean. So white has got this huge gaping hole on e4 here. And imagine black pieces, a rook and a queen, or that's probably the other way around would be better. Queen, rook here, pointing at this white pawn that just cannot move forward. It's a backward pawn. It can never be defended by another pawn from f3 or d3, so it's stuck. It will become a target. The white pawn on g4 isn't considered to be backward, because if white plays h3 and then g4, then there's some support on that square. So this one can go forward with support. But if this one goes forward, it's just going to be taken. So a big weakness. Let's have a look at this position here now for you to consider. So what's the weak pawn in this position? What's the backward pawn? And if you've said d3, you are correct. So although this time there's no way to pile up on the pawn on the d file because black has his own pawn in the way, nonetheless, this will be a weakness in the endgame because it can't be supported by a friendly pawn. So you might imagine a bishop over here attacking it, and possibly a knights from b4 and c5. It really could be a weakness in an endgame. all of the black pawns defend each other or can defend each other, but this one here is the potential weakness. So definitely if we get to an endgame with that pawn formation, slight advantage to black. Pawn majorities. Okay, so this is a situation where one side has more pawns than the other on one side of the board. And what this will allow you to do is create a passed pawn. A passed pawn we've come across, it's one that has no enemy pawn in front of it or to the side of it. So it's basically has a clear run to the other side of the board to become a queen. So here is a situation we can see 3 pawn islands for black, 2 for white. And the pawn majority is for white on the queen side. Now, if you took everything off of the king side and just played 3v2 as a pawn war, you'd easily see that white can create a passed pawn with 3v2. Very, very straightforward. I mean, there's other pieces on the board, but just much easier for white to create one this side. Black on this side has 4 against 3, but because there's 2 islands and because these 2 here are isolated and doubled, there's no real way for black to create a passed pawn here. Just can't do it. So if this H pawn comes marching down the board, it'll get taken, and then these 2 would just block each other. Meanwhile, 2 versus 2 can't force a passed pawn. So the white pawn majority, because of the strength of the white pawn structure, is great. The black pawn majority on the right-hand side of the board on the king side is a bit rubbish. Similar sort of thing here. White's got 4 to 3 on this side, can probably create a passed pawn with this one because although they're doubled, they're not isolated, so should be able to create a passed pawn. But black's 4 against 3 is much, much better because white's pawns are doubled and isolated. And again, you can see 2 black pawn islands, 1, 2, 3 white ones. It's so often the case that the person with fewer pawn islands has the slight advantage. So definitely advantage black with this structure because the 4 against 3 here is much, much better than the 4 against 3 over here. We need to think about passed pawns, particularly supported and distant passed pawns. So let's have a look at each. And in this position, white has a passed pawn. It's on c5. And what that means is it's run to the promotion square c8 is clear. There's no pawns to the side of it that can take him. So he's completely clear. And because he's what's called a supported passed pawn, which means he's currently got protection from his friend on b4, is extremely strong indeed. And all else being equal, that would be enough to win the game because white would get an extra queen. In this situation, although black has 3 against 2 on this side and fewer pawn islands, actually this is an exception and white would be winning this. And the reason is the distant passed pawn. So what can happen is white can use this pawn, march it up the board towards the queening square. Oops. And while the black king is busy coming across to prevent it, white will have time to march his king in here and mop up these black pawns. So you might have a4, king d6, a5, king c6, king e4, king b5, king e5, king takes pawn, king to f6, king to b5, king takes here, g5, king to g6, and this black king will be just too far away to stop the white king gobbling up these pawns. So a distant passed pawn is a real strength in an endgame most of the time because it's a distraction. Okay, so that's pawn structure. Very briefly, there's an awful lot more to it than that, but it gives you a pretty good idea of some of the strengths and weaknesses of the pawns. So as you're playing now, if there's no obvious way to win pieces with tactics, start to think about ways you can strengthen your position or weaken your opponent's position. So can you do anything to take advantage of pawn structures and pawn weaknesses? Okay, brilliant. As ever, write down your moves while you're playing and enjoy your chess.